All right, welcome everybody. I'm Bob Schneider. I'm one of the co-chairs of our Department of Urban Planning. Welcome to our December Innovative Cities lecture. It'll be shifting gears toward a new way of thinking about transportation by Professor Susan Handy, and we'll get to that in just a second, but we'll start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We feel it's important as planners who are working to create more equitable communities that we share resources to deepen your knowledge and connection with Indigenous communities. We encourage everyone to review the Indigenous land map to find the territories and languages in the areas where you live or work. Moving on to our Innovative Cities lecture for today, we're really glad to be joined by Susan Handy. I'll introduce her in just a second, but I want to highlight that the spring semester lecture series will continue. You see the list there. I just want to draw your attention to April 23rd. That will be an in-person lecture. It'll be our annual Causler lecture. The rest of them will be online. So we look forward to hearing more and seeing many of you throughout the next semester as well. So Susan Handy is with us today. She's a professor at the University of California, Davis. She's a director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and her research focuses on strategies for reducing automobile dependence. I was really fortunate to have a chance to work with her as a postdoc back in 2012, and being an internationally recognized scholar in travel behavior and pedestrian and bicycle transportation, she's just a really kind person, besides being innovative. And she's mentored hundreds of students who are now in academia or in professional work, making changes to try to create more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. So it's an honor to have you here today, Susan, and I'll turn it over to you.
Right, thank you for that lovely introduction, Bob. You were the best postdoc I've ever had, so it was a pleasure to work with you. And I just want to thank you and Carolyn for the opportunity to be here today and share some of my thinking about the way we think in the transportation profession. And thanks to all of you who are out there somewhere listening in. So I'm coming to you from Davis, California. I thought I would show you where that is in case some of you don't know, right smack dab in the middle of California between San Francisco and Lake Tahoe. Davis is quite famous for its bicycling. We have the highest bicycling mode share in the US. But of course, California is especially famous for its freeways. We have lots of freeways, we have lots of drivers, we have lots of cars and trucks, lots of people driving all of them, and it adds up to a whole lot of vehicle miles of travel, otherwise known as VMT, which is a big buzzword for us here in California. So all of that VMT raises lots of sustainability concerns, from air quality to congestion levels, safety, and we're clearly in a safety crisis, whether we're talking about car crashes or fatalities and injuries for bicyclists and pedestrians. All of this creates stress that affects our health and our quality of life. We've got concerns about the resiliency of our transportation system, and we've had enough events to know that it's not as resilient as it's going to need to be. The contribution of all that driving to sprawl and how sprawl is tied up with this whole car-dependent system impacts on wildlife. We have a road ecology center here at UC Davis that studies these interactions between cars and wildlife. And then, of course, equity and the fact that this very car-oriented system is not serving everybody's needs very well. And the people it is disproportionately harming are also the ones who are least well served by the system. And of course, all of that VMT is contributing to our very critical climate moment. The news in the last week or two has been really very dire. And it's clear that we need to be doing more than we have been. And that includes changing what we do with respect to our transportation system. So California has been working on this for quite some time. Going back to 2006, we have policy that put in place very ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we've been working hard on that and making some progress, but we still have a long ways to go. One of the big strategies we've adopted for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, which is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California, is to shift to electric vehicles. So you may know about our Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which says that by 2035, we're going to have 100% of new cars and light trucks sold in California be zero emission vehicles. So a big push towards electrification, and we're actually making pretty remarkable progress so far. If you drive around in California, you see Teslas and other electric vehicles all over the place. But the state's analysis also shows that that's not enough, that even if we electrify the entire fleet, that's going to take some time. And even once we get there, it's not enough to get us to our goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the state also has policy about reducing vehicle miles of travel, or VMT. So the state has set targets for each of our large metropolitan areas as to how much they need to reduce their VMT. And they require the metropolitan planning organizations in the state to show, as a part of their regional transportation planning effort, what policies they're going to put in place to bring about those reductions in vehicle miles of travel. Now, what's interesting is that those plans, those regional transportation plans, still include a whole lot of freeway widening projects, including a very controversial widening of Interstate 80 that runs right through Davis and links Davis to Sacramento. So here's the question. Why is California widening freeways at the same time that it is trying to reduce driving? My wonderful PhD student, Amy Lee, who is actually no longer a PhD student because she did finish her dissertation at the end of the summer. Her award-winning dissertation delves very deeply into this question and finds some really interesting things that I'm not going to talk about, but I encourage you to seek that out. It is now available online, and it's a very, very interesting story. But I'm going to talk about the thinking that underlies this. And if you look at what's going on in transportation right now, it's a really interesting moment, because on one hand, we do have a lot of these widening projects being constructed and being proposed around the country, in large part by the state departments of transportation. But at the same time, we've got many cities working very hard to build a different kind of transportation system that is less car oriented and provides alternative ways for the population to get around. And as I understand it, there's a lot of this effort going on in Milwaukee right now. So I find this very interesting that we've got very different approaches to transportation happening at the same time. And what I wanted to do was think about what is behind this. So this is what I do in my recently published book, Shifting Gears, is sort of peel back the layers to think about what are the ideas and the ways of thinking underneath these choices that we're making about the transportation system. So my thesis is that the ideas that are embraced by the profession at any moment in time shape the transportation system in fundamental ways. And so it's really important to understand those ideas and where they come from. And then what's interesting about this moment is that the ideas that have traditionally dominated the profession over the last century seem to be shifting to a new way of thinking that could lead, I think probably will lead to a different kind of transportation system. So it's these ideas and the shift in ideas that I'm interested in exploring. And, you know, if we are going to address all of these various crises that are related to the transportation system, we've really got to start with the thinking, right? It's the set of ideas that make up our way of thinking in the profession that shapes our practices, our tools, our guidelines, that also shape our policies and decisions, all of which produce the transportation system. So if we want a different kind of transportation system in the end, we need a different way of thinking at the beginning. Okay, so, and I'm going to take you through some specific examples of this that I hope will make this clearer. But one thing I need to do at the start is define what I mean by the transportation profession, because I'm going to focus on the ideas, the way of thinking that dominate the transportation profession. So this is a little tricky because the boundaries can be fuzzy, but the way I think about it is that it's the employees of the various agencies at all levels of government who hold the responsibility for planning, building, operating, maintaining the transportation system. So they're really at the core of the profession. And I should say, when I say transportation system, I'm talking largely about the roadway system, transit service, the part of the system that serves our daily transportation passenger needs. So focusing on the employees of these agencies because they are so central to what we actually do with the system. But there are a lot of other folks that have input into it as well, including the consultants that the agencies often hire. They're important professional associations that guide and influence the way of thinking in the profession. And I'd like to think that us academics have some role to play here as well. So in my book, I focus on 9 ideas that I see as being very important to the core of the transportation profession. These aren't necessarily the only important ideas. I know there are more out there, but these are ones I chose to focus on. And again, I'm going to go through a few of these in more detail. But these ideas, you know, if you look below the surface of what the profession is doing, these are the kinds of ideas that you find that explain what it is that we're doing and why. And if you add these up, what you get is a focus on making it easier to drive. And I would argue that these ideas have really dominated the profession for at least the last century. These ideas are very much embedded in transportation practice in the various sorts of guidance documents, standards, standard practices that the profession depends on. So the Highway Capacity Manual, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, what we call the Green Book, a policy on geometric design of highways and streets. If you look at these documents, you see these ideas I'm going to talk about very much reflected in what is articulated and recommended in these documents. What's interesting is that latest versions of these documents are beginning to reflect a somewhat different way of thinking. And, you know, there's been a lot of push from within the profession to change the nature of these documents and what it is that they recommend. So I believe the MUTCD, we're still in a big debate about the latest version of that. So that's very interesting to me too, because again, it suggests that there's some change happening, that maybe there's some cracks in the dominance of these very traditional ideas. And in fact, for each one of these traditional ideas, it's possible to identify an alternative idea, a different way of thinking that actually isn't necessarily new. In all these cases, there were people within the profession arguing these alternative ideas from very early on. What's new is the traction that they're gaining within the profession, that more and more transportation professionals are thinking in this alternative way. And if you add up these alternative ideas, what you get is a way of thinking that aims towards making it easier and safer not to drive. So that's a very big shift. So what I'm going to do is go through a few of these pairs of ideas and talk a little bit about what's going on with each, and think about this shift and to what degree this is and isn't happening. So since I started with talking about freeway widening, let's start with this idea of capacity. This is the idea that it is the job of the transportation professional to provide enough capacity in the form of freeway lanes and other roadway capacity to accommodate demand. This is an idea that goes way back in the transportation profession. So even before we were talking about interstates, there was a lot of thinking about the need for freeways to move the growing numbers of cars that we had on our roads. So you can find plans for freeways all through cities like San Francisco, even back in the 1940s. And that, of course, evolved into our traditional predict and provide approach, where we use our regional travel demand forecasting models as a way to predict what congestion levels are going to be at some point in the future, and thus how much additional freeway capacity we are going to need. And this is an approach that has pretty well dominated transportation planning since the 1950s. Now, what's wrong with this approach? Well, what it does is ignore the well-known phenomenon of induced travel, whereby capacity expansion leads to an increase in volume rather than a decrease in congestion. So as early as the 1920s, there were some officials who understood this. There's a great paper by the historian Brian Ladd who documents the fact that people were talking about this induced travel phenomenon even way back then. But this understanding of this phenomenon does not seem to have had much impact on what we were actually choosing to do with our transportation system. So by now, we have a whole lot of empirical evidence that this induced travel phenomenon is real. And we spent some time at UC Davis reviewing this evidence and synthesizing it. And what we conclude is that in the long run, there's close to an elasticity of 1, meaning that if you expand the capacity by 1%, you will get a 1% increase in vehicle miles traveled after a period of 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. So in other words, you widen the highway, you will increase vehicle miles of travel. and you are not likely to be decreasing congestion to a measurable degree. So this is, very counter to this idea that we should be expanding our highways. Highway widening projects are still promoted as a way to reduce congestion. I'm going to talk more about congestion in a minute. We took this evidence and created what's called the UC Davis, I think we're now calling it the California Induced Travel Calculator. So it takes this elasticity that we derive out of all of that good, robust research and put it into a pretty simple little spreadsheet tool that anyone can use to calculate what would be the increase in vehicle miles of travel for a given freeway widening in California. So Caltrans, our California Department of Transportation, has officially signed off on this calculator as an acceptable technique for analyzing the increase in vehicle miles of travel for freeway widenings, which is now required for the environmental impact assessment of these proposed highway widening projects. And I think I talk a little more about that in another minute. Okay, so this is a big challenge to this traditional way of thinking that that what we need to be doing is expanding highways to accommodate all demand and as a way to reduce congestion. That's starting to change. Again, we're seeing some cracks in those traditional ideas. So there has been some rethinking of freeway projects, even in California. We've dropped at least one proposed freeway widening in the Los Angeles area once it was, kind of officially accepted that maybe this isn't the best thing to be doing for our communities. There's a lot of rethinking of existing freeways, including, as I understand it, one in Milwaukee, where communities are thinking maybe we don't actually need all this freeway capacity here, and our communities would be better off if we remove the freeway and reuse that space. And of course, we have federal funding that is helping to support some of these projects. And then the alternative idea, if we're not going to add capacity, then what do we do instead? So the alternative idea is that maybe our job is to be managing demand rather than accommodating all possible demand. Demand management is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time, but generally as a supplement to adding capacity. What's different now is that that we're really taking on demand management as maybe a primary approach to addressing the challenges in our transportation system. So, for example, it appears that we're going to have congestion pricing in Manhattan by this spring, and that to me is a really big deal. Not just because it's the first time we're doing this this approach in the U.S., but because it reflects a change in thinking, a pivot away from the traditional focus on our role in providing capacity. Okay, another idea that's obviously really essential to all of this is the idea of vehicles. And we're talking about capacity for vehicles. We measure capacity with respect to vehicle throughput. We design spaces for vehicles. And again, the profession has defined its job this way, that it's our job to be accommodating vehicles. So this can be problematic. One of the problems is that our cars are getting bigger and bigger. Not only are we buying bigger cars, but the model or particular models of cars are themselves getting bigger over time. So we have bigger and bigger cars, which is a huge safety concern. It's also a concern from the standpoint of simply consumption of space, that cars are not a space-efficient way to move people, as this very popular meme depicts. So here, I think we are seeing some big shift in thinking about space and what we want to do with our space. So a lot of communities are reallocating that car space to other uses. Road diets, popular all through the country, all kinds of different places, where some of that car space is reused for transit, for bicycles, for pedestrians. And of course, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of reuse of street space for purposes other than cars. And I think this too is helping to push the thinking and reminding people that that this space, our street space, is a really valuable public resource, and that maybe the default shouldn't be that it goes to cars, but really that we could be using it in some ways that would be much better for the community. Now, reusing car space tends to make businesses a little nervous. So there's a lot of pushback from businesses when you talk about taking out parking and putting in bike lanes. But here's a place where the academics can make a difference in influencing that way of thinking. So we have some very important and fun research about this issue of street space, and in fact, studies that show that when you install bike lanes, actually business activity goes up, not down. I love this work by Adam Millard-Ball about our excessively wide streets. That's a street in my neighborhood that's actually a cul-de-sac and is far wider than it by any rationale needs to be. How that adds to the cost of housing in a state where we've got a huge affordable housing problem. Okay, and then there's rethinking parking. And all of that space we've devoted to not moving cars, but storing cars. So here we're seeing some really big shifting, thanks in large part to Donald Shoup and his wonderful work out of UCLA. Lots of change in thinking about parking, lots of communities doing away with their minimum parking requirements, recognizing again that that space is a valuable resource and maybe we want to use it in some other ways than simply storing cars. Okay, another idea we should talk about is this idea of mobility. So we are adding all of that highway capacity for vehicles as a way to increase mobility, which we can define as the ease of movement, in this case for cars. The corollary of this idea of mobility is the idea that congestion is bad. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Well, yes, congestion is bad. Nobody likes congestion. Nobody likes being stuck in traffic. Again, we have good research that documents all of the costs of congestion to society, to us as individuals. So congestion has been a big concern for a long time in the profession. We measure congestion as level of service, where level of service is a function of the volume of cars on the roadway relative to the capacity of the roadway. Level of service is the driving force behind many of our transportation decisions, like highway widenings. Highway widenings are sold as a way to reduce congestion and improve level of service. In other words, what we're aiming to do is move as many cars as we can without slowing them down. But the question is that what really matters? Is that the idea we should be focusing on? So the alternative, and again, this one I think has gained lots of credence within the profession, is the idea that accessibility is the real goal. If we stop and think about it. Accessibility meaning, can people get to where they need to be? Lewis Mumford back in the 50s talked about this. He may not have used the term accessibility, but that's what he was talking about. the idea that transportation is a means and not an end in and of itself. So let's focus on the end rather than the means. That the purpose of transportation is to bring people or goods to places where they are needed. So the purpose of transportation isn't simply to move people, it's to get people to where they need to be. And you may need movement to do that, but maybe, depending on how we design our communities, we can make it possible for people to get where they need to be without so much movement. So you may have heard of this idea of a 15-minute city, or sometimes it's a 15-minute neighborhood, or sometimes it's a 20-minute neighborhood. But it's all really the same idea, which is let's design our communities so that we have more of what we need within a shorter distance. In other words, let's give people accessibility that is less dependent on movement and on driving in particular. Can we make it possible for people to get to not everything they need, but a lot of what they need on a daily basis within a reasonable walking or biking distance? So accessibility is something I've been thinking about for a long time. How do we achieve accessibility? Well, if accessibility is, you can think of it as a function of proximity to destinations. How far away are you from various destinations? And that's about land use planning. But it's also about connectivity to those places. And so that's about network design and the transportation planning that determines the design of the network. So in other words, focusing on accessibility as the goal of what we're doing as the transportation profession takes a shift in thinking about transportation, but also a shift in thinking about land use and land use planning. And that's hard because those aren't the same people, right? The transportation profession has responsibility for transportation, but land use is often handled very separately from what's going on in transportation. So this disconnect between land use planning and transportation planning is a big obstacle to doing good accessibility planning. I think another thing that's slowed down kind of the adoption of accessibility within the profession is the fact that we don't have standardized, agreed upon ways of measuring accessibility the way we have agreed upon standardized ways of measuring congestion with level of service. So there's been a lot of work going on the development of accessibility measures, in academia, but also in agencies themselves. And is there a question? Sorry, thought I heard something. Okay, I would refer you to this recent NCHRP report, which is a wonderful guide to thinking about how to do accessibility measurement in practice. And then, as I said, a lot of agencies have been thinking about this as well. So in a lot of these regional transportation plans, not only are we seeing the traditional congestion analysis, but also accessibility analysis. So how much difference is our plan going to make in terms of providing accessibility to jobs and other kinds of important destinations, like in this case, grocery stores? And then another thing that I think will help this shift towards an accessibility way of thinking is if we step back from this focus on level of service as our primary way of measuring the performance of the transportation system. And in California now, and other parts of the country are thinking about this as well, there's been a shift to focusing on VMT as the performance measure as a part of the environmental review process. That congestion is really not an environmental issue. The environmental issue is how much driving we're doing. So again, we have this problem that we don't have very standardized ways of measuring and analyzing the VMT impacts of projects. But we're working it through in California. There's a big effort here to try and figure this out because it's now state law and we have to. Okay, a couple more ideas I want to go through with a little time I have left. I think, if we're going to shift our thinking on capacity, vehicles, mobility, all of that, we got to dig a little deeper even than that and think about this idea of speed. We humans like speed. We like going fast. Speed is thrilling. We like to get places quickly because travel time is wasted time, right? So professionally, we equate speed with efficiency. The goal is to minimize travel times. Travel is a disutility. It's an economic cost. We want to be able to move people quickly to where they're going. But of course, what's the problem is that that speed comes with an impact on safety. So the faster that we're going, the less safe the system is, and that's especially true for people outside of vehicles. I'm sure you've seen diagrams like this that show just how much difference speed makes. So we do regulate speed. We set speed limits, but how do we do that? Well, we set speed limits based on how fast drivers are actually going. That's the whole 85th percentile rule approach to setting speed limits, rather than thinking about how fast we want drivers to go and setting the speed limits accordingly. So again, in a lot of communities, there's pushback on this traditional way of thinking about speed with campaigns like 20 is plenty. I've seen lots of those around the country. But it's hard to get people to drive more slowly if roads are built for speed. So we've got to think about how we design roads as well. And in the name of safety, we have been building straight, wide, clear roads so that we lower the risk of crashing. But if you do that, if you have wide, straight, clear roads, people are also going to go faster. So you go faster, and the implications of a crash are going to be worse. So it's sort of a self-defeating approach to safety to make things straighter, wider, clearer. What do we do when we've got a safety problem on local streets? We may think about traffic calming as a way to change the design of the street to slow people down. And of course, we do this all over the place, and this idea has been around for a long time. So we've got this, it's sort of a tension between we want to make people go fast, but then we also recognize that going fast is a problem, and then we implement these strategies to kind of counteract the poor design choices we made in the first place. So more shifting and thinking to be done here. And maybe what we need to do is recognize that, slow can even be good. So again, the pandemic, I think, helped to illustrate this, and that helped to promote the adoption of slow streets in different cities around the country. I include that picture on the right because that's two of my former students who one day happened to meet on the train between Sacramento and the Bay Area just by chance, and had a nice chat and took a selfie to send to me because they were excited to run into each other. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, doesn't happen when you're driving, right? So the train might be a little slower, and actually sometimes it's faster, but there are these other benefits you get from slower travel. And I could talk forever about how biking fits into this. Okay, and then, speed, if you talk about slowing people down, you bump up against this idea of freedom of the open road, the ability to go where and when we want, as fast as we want to get there. This needs some pushback as well. Cars are not always about freedom. For one, not everybody has access to a car, especially lower income households. If you think about the cost of owning and operating a car, it doesn't feel so much like freedom. That the cost is a huge burden on all of us, and especially on the 75% of households with incomes under 25,000 who do own a car because they really have no other choice and other way to get around. I think the focus on cars as freedom also distracts us from the larger problem that not everyone has equal freedom of movement in this country by car or by other means. In the US, Black and brown people are more likely to be stopped and cited as drivers, but also as pedestrians and bicyclists. Movement of women is also constrained by very real concerns over personal security. This is also an issue for members of the LGBTQ community. And so maybe rather than thinking about cars as freedom, we need a broader conception of freedom. And I very much like this idea of mobility justice. I think this gives us a really important alternative way to think about transportation that leads us to some very different kinds of solutions and ways of defining problems. So I'm going to speed through this last little bit here. I can't end without saying a little bit about technology, because I think this has been a really important idea for the transportation profession. We've long put our faith in technology as a way of solving our problems. The public likes this idea too. Can we have our cake and eat it too? Can technology fix everything so that we don't have to give up our cars and change how we live our lives? So, of course, technology has been really important when we talk about the progress we've made on air quality and also safety. Technology has been really important. Electric vehicles, again, a really important component of our effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all of that driving. But we've got the question of autonomous vehicles now, and I don't know if you've been following what's going on with Cruise in San Francisco, but the technology has a ways to go. It's raised quite a few safety concerns there. And then I worry a lot about the potential implications of autonomous vehicles to lead to even more driving than we have now, for reasons we can talk about if you're interested. And then, we can look at all the silly sort of technological ideas that we're going to change everything and didn't and probably never will. So when we talk about technology, I like to think about our old technologies and the important role they can still play in our system, especially if we use new technology to update and improve those old approaches to transportation. So bike share systems, big impact around the world. Electric assist bicycles. We had more e-bike sales in the US in 2021 than we had electric vehicle sales. I'm seeing them everywhere. And then, of course, we have e-bike sharing. So a lot of the bike sharing systems now have e-bikes, which is a great way to get people familiar with e-bikes and how useful they can be. We've done research that shows that that people really like riding shared e-bikes, that it's fun. And I call this the fun factor. And this is what's going to get more people doing it. When it's fun, people like to bike. But of course, e-bikes can also be very practical. So e-cargo bikes, again, there's more activity in this area. Some of my colleagues are doing research on this. And in Davis, we see those bakfiets with the kids all the time. Okay, so future mobility, there's lots of talk about autonomous vehicles. Is that going to solve all our problems? I'm very skeptical of that. I think that's simply going to create a whole lot more problems. And so I like to remind people that there are other ways to go driverless. All right, so that was a lot. If we look at each one of these ideas, and I left a few out in the interest of time today, we can see some shifting from these traditional ideas towards these alternative ideas. I would say that some have shifted farther and more robustly than others. But the question here is, is this enough shifting that we may actually be at the point of a paradigm shift, where for a century we focused on making it easier to drive, and pretty much everything we did was about that, towards a new way of thinking where we're focusing on making it easier to not drive. I'd like to think we're tipping over to that new way of thinking, but I've been using this slide for a long time, so that worries me a bit. And if I very unscientifically sort of plot out the acceptance level for traditional ideas versus alternative ideas, very unscientifically, I see a lot of uptick in the new ideas. But what I'm concerned about is that we're not necessarily letting go of the old ideas, that what we're doing is layering the new ideas onto the old ones. And I think that explains this apparent contradiction where we're investing in freeway widenings at the same time that we are investing in transit and other forms of transportation. So I think of this as the throw everything at it mentality, where the it is congestion, and we're doing everything we can. But if we're doing this, this, to me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're not going to solve congestion this way, and we're not really giving the alternatives a fair shake if we're investing in them at the same time that we continue to focus on trying to make it easier to drive. And again, we can talk more about this if you want, but I think, the really big problem is we've got to give up our obsession with congestion and defining the big challenge in transportation as being about congestion. So in the end, I think we need to do some deep thinking about transportation and the ideas at the core of the profession. I hope this talk has encouraged some thinking on your part, and I look forward to hearing what you think.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan. I see your book there. Here's the actual paper copy in my hands. I want to say that as all of you, if you get this book and read it, the language and the way that Susan writes it is so accessible. It's like hearing this presentation, just lots more details behind all of that information, just explaining how incredibly complex the system is. So thanks for sharing all that, Susan. We have some really good questions in the chat that I just want to get to right now.
I think I should stop sharing the screen. Should I stop sharing? Yeah.
Actually, I think you can keep the screen on because we may want to go back to a couple of those slides. We'll see. The first one was about the 15-minute city. And basically, the question was, I've had some pushback on that in professional circles as well as from political realm. What has been your take on the discussion around 15-minute cities since you did bring that up? What are your current thoughts?
Yeah, I know. Nothing is not controversial, right? Yeah, I mean, I love the concept just because I think it helps. It's a way to explain this idea of accessibility, right? So I think it's been really important from that standpoint. Yeah, some of the pushback, well, there's that pushback. Oh, you're going to make us give up our cars and only be able to shop at the local store. And of course, that's not the idea, right? The idea of the 15-minute city is about making driving less possible, making it possible to drive less, to have those nearby options. And then the other critique I've heard is this is only for rich people, right? Which I don't totally understand, because you can find a lot of places, lower income places that effectively are 15-minute cities, right? I mean, it's not necessarily in any way tied to income. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's an important idea to think about what's possible with our communities and sort of tying together land use with transportation.
Definitely. We had a good question as well about sort of from a technical perspective, what are some examples of accessibility criteria that could be included in various types of redevelopment projects or TOD projects? Anything you've worked with, suggested in your time?
Well, or like measures,
Yeah,
metrics.
measures that could be
Yeah,
used. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So of course we academics like, we like fancy measures like log sum measures and blah, blah, blah. I think just very simple measures can be really helpful. Like how far is it to the nearest destination of certain types? So think about, okay, well, grocery stores for one is something we should always be thinking about. What's the access to places for people to buy food, and especially to buy healthy food. So some very simple mapping of just where are things relative to this project we might be focusing on. And of course, transit-oriented development, we're talking about access to transit, right? So that's a part of the definition there. But I think some just very simple measures like distance to the closest X or numbers of X's within a certain radius can be very helpful.
Great. We had a few questions also about mobility justice. And of course, many of us, planners are interested in equity at the core of what we do. And you touched on it near the end where you were talking about automobile ownership, Black and Brown communities, accessibility for women,
So create like
those sorts of
15
things.
minutes.
Do you have any resources or other thoughts on that where you could expand on that idea, especially in particular, how can we frame the shift in thinking in transportation so that it has that mobility justice lens?
Yeah, so I really like that the Untokening 1.0 website, I think is a great resource. That was a group of young transportation professionals of various backgrounds who developed that, and that's really helped me a lot. So I'd point people there, and helping me think about kind of the layers of the concept. So, we often talk about transportation equity in terms of, the services or possibilities available to people. But then there's also the impact of the transportation system. So you get into environmental justice sorts of concerns as well. But then, mobility justice is even broader than all of that, and encompasses the power of a community to shape their own transportation system, but not just the physical system, it's also the social systems around that, like the policing that happens in those neighborhoods. So I find that really valuable. And I don't know, car is freedom. I don't know if we ever get away from that idea. That just seems so core to how most of us think. So this may be a case where it has to be a layering on rather than a letting go of the traditional. But I think if we can put more priority around mobility justice, it changes what we do. And some of the other ideas, we see some shifting in the other ideas along with that, if we can focus on mobility justice.
Absolutely. There's a great question here. What work is being done to convince the top authorities in our nation to shift towards the new way of thinking? I'll add on a little piece to that is, well, who are these people who need to be convinced?
Right. Yeah. Those are both good questions. So, we have groups like Transportation for America, which has been working very hard for a long time to change thinking at the federal level. Who are those people? Of course, depends in part on who is our president and who they bring in to lead that organization. So at the top, we've got the appointees, and they bring a way of thinking with them. But we do have the staff, which at USDOT and other federal agencies where you don't have so much turnover. So how they think is very important too. And we've had some conversations with them about this whole induced travel phenomenon. That's something they're very concerned about. Yeah, so I think there's some alternative thinking going on there. I think the state DOTs might be a little tougher, and my apologies to any state DOT people out there, but it makes sense because they were created with the mission of building highways. They were highway departments to start with. So that's a century of practice that we're talking about trying to shift, and it's a redefining of their mission. So I think that's a little harder. And then there's Congress. Don't forget them, because they're the ones who pass the legislation that dictates how we spend our transportation money, which is still 80% highways, 20% transit and other stuff.
So thank you for that. Great thoughts on all these questions. I'm just going to have one final question, but I want to point everybody to make sure to fill out the post-lecture survey. And if you want to get AICP credit, that's also offered, so you can get certification maintenance. We appreciate Susan being here to help with that and give us the information that we need on the latest types of thinking. My last question to you is, I was kind of saddened or lost some hope when I saw one of your first slides that shows the greenhouse gas changes over the last 20 or 30 years, and then the goal for 2050 for California. The 2020 had been up from previous years. So what are you most hopeful about in terms of making this shift in the way of thinking? Is there, do you have hope about the greenhouse gas reductions? Do you have hope about other areas of the system, because it's so complex? What are you most hopeful about?
Oh, yeah. Some days I'm not at all hopeful. Other days I have more hope. Yeah, well, I think the cities are actually, that's the big hope, because I think cities get all of this, and the efforts that they're making to make it possible for people to get around by means other than driving, and making sure that everybody in the community has access to things that they need. I find that all very hopeful. And I think we're chipping away at the highway problem between cities that are saying, hey, we need to take out this highway. More attention to the negative impacts of the highway widening, and not just but the obsession with congestion is a really hard nut to crack, because none of us like it, but we've just got to worry less about it. If we create places where people have options, congestion becomes irrelevant. And I think we've got to get to that point.
Well, that's great places for people. Exactly. So thank you, Susan. That was fantastic. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for answering all our questions. Again, everybody, please take the survey at the end. But Susan, you're a fantastic speaker as a part of our Innovative Cities lecture. We really appreciate you here at UW-Milwaukee, and thanks for all the work that you're doing for around for people, advocates, and professionals around the world on this topic. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining today. We'll see you next time.